During the Archaic Age, the Greeks developed the city-state, or polis, as their most widespread and influential political form. City-states were organized based on citizenship. There were free male citizens, free female citizens, their children, and non-citizens who were either resident foreigners or slaves. Polis, the Greek word from which we derive the English word politics, is translated as city-state to differentiate it from what we think of as a modern city. A city-state did not only comprise an urban area surrounded by its defensive walls, but the surrounding countryside and farmland were considered part of the polis as well. Free urban and rural residents of a polis were granted equal citizenship and were considered politically unified as part of the same independent state. Although citizenship was extended to all free males and females, only men could politically participate in the state, but that is not to say that women did not have any legal protections or social rights. Members of a polis also had an obligation to religious unity in first honoring the city's patron deity, followed by the other deities of the Greek pantheon. The ritual sacrifice of animals to the gods and sharing the meat in a communal meal was a common show of religious solidarity in the polis. The philosopher Aristotle insisted that the formation of the polis was simply part of the natural order. He wrote, "From these things, therefore, it is clear that the city-state is a natural growth, and that man is by nature a political animal." Although most city-states were separated from each other by the naturally mountainous terrain of Greece, even in areas where contact could be easily made between city-states, such as the plains of Boeotia, each polis retained its independence. Some Greeks had immigrated east out of the mainland to live in Ionia as early as the 9th century BC, but by 750 BC, colonies were being established as far away as the southern part of Spain and the northern coast of the Black Sea. The surge of colonization during the Archaic Age led to the establishment of hundreds of new trading colonies and city-states across the Mediterranean region. The individual desire to become rich through international trade was motivation enough for many Greeks to leave their homeland, and some of them moved to already established Phoenician colonies. Some traders during this time set out to establish their own trading posts as private enterprises. Greeks who heard from these traders about where to settle overseas in search of a better life were sometimes sent out in groups to establish colonies on behalf of their mother city, or metropolis in Greek. Sometimes the people sent out on an expedition were willing to go, and sometimes they were sent by force. The foundation decree of Cyrene, a North African colony established by a group from the polis of Thera, records just how messy the colonization process could be. It seemed good to the assembly, whereas Apollo spontaneously declared that Batos and the Therians should settle the colony of Cyrene. The Therians decided that Batos should be sent to Libya as chief of mission and king, that Therians should sail off as companions, that they should sail off on equal and same terms from each family, one son being chosen from each family, that would also be allowed to sail off all the other citizens of age, and among the rest of the Therians any free man who would be willing, that, if the settlers hold on the settlement, anyone amongst the Therians who would later on sail to Libya should take part in the civil rights and honors and should receive by lot a portion of owner-free land, that if on the contrary they do not hold on the settlement and are not able to settle on the city but are compelled by overwhelming necessity, they should within 5 years fearless leave the country and sail back to Thera and their belongings and be full right citizens, that anyone who would refuse to sail when the city wants to send him would be liable to death penalty, and his belongings should be confiscated, that anyone who would shelter or conceal him, be it a father for his son or a brother for his brother, should be liable to the same penalty as the rebel. Such are the clauses on which they took oath, as well those who remained on the spot as those who were sailing off with the aim of settlement, and they uttered curses against who would transgress those clauses and would not abide to them, either amongst those settled in Libya, or amongst those remaining on the spot. If this inscription, written 300 years after the establishment of the colony, is to be trusted, the men of Thera sent on the colonizing expedition were reluctant to leave their homes. Expeditions such as these were not usually organized because people thought that life in a colony would be easier than life on the Greek mainland. Establishing a colony was a rough order of business. There was always uncertainty about the future, and there were no guarantees that the locals would respond positively to the Greeks' presence. Colonizing expeditions were often sent out, as in the case of the Therians, because a polis could no longer support its growing population on its own, or because a polis was simply trying to rid itself of its undesirables. The increase in international trade during the Archaic period led to the Greeks contacting outside peoples, especially in Anatolia and the Near East. The Greeks' interactions with these people would have a great impact on their culture and everyday life. The freestanding sculptures of Near Eastern art influenced Greek sculptors, and the temples of Egypt inspired an architectural revival that produced large, expensive buildings. The most notable changes in Greek culture came from the Lydians and the Phoenicians, though. Up until this point, the Greeks had economically operated on the barter system, but during the 6th century BC, they learned how to mint coins from the Lydians. After they adopted this technology, bartering remained popular, but they gradually moved towards a currency-based economy. Their contact with the Phoenicians reintroduced them to writing, and they adopted the Phoenician alphabet, which eventually evolved into the Greek alphabet as we know it to keep accounting records. This system of writing expanded beyond the realm of business and was soon used for literary purposes, like recording Homeric poetry. But due to the agriculture-centered economy and a lack of schools during the Archaic Age, it would still take a while before most Greeks achieved basic literacy. Competition for international markets greatly impacted the fortunes of larger city-states like Corinth, whose geographical position on the isthmus connecting northern and southern Greece provided a great advantage in controlling the flow of trade. Amid all these changes and the growing competition, keep in mind that everything the Greeks did was rooted in their religious beliefs, and the gods had a central role to play in every decision a polis would make. Identifying all the reasons for this dramatic change in Greek political structure remains something of a mystery. The economic revival and population boom that was taking place during the Archaic Age certainly helped. The greatest increase in population probably was not among the elite members of society, but among the poor and working-class families. As more of the common people became landowners as the economy improved, they came to resent the members of the aristocracy who were still trying to lord their authority over them, almost like they were kings. In short, they wanted to be treated as equals. When the city-state and the concept of citizenship emerged, the commoners and the elite made a sort of compromise. Every free person would be granted citizenship and equitable treatment under the law, while the elite could still retain leadership positions and have a hand in implementing policies that were agreed upon by the community. While social and economic inequality remained, this new change in political structure helped to bridge the gap at least a little bit. Despite the limited equality found in Greek city-states, its creation nevertheless was a huge step forward in that even the poorest of the poor now had some legal protections and political rights. Again, how even the poorest of men gained these rights is not something that we can know with 100% certainty, but the best theory we have is called by scholars the Hoplite Revolution. Hoplites were infantrymen decked out in armor that made up the bulk of force in the militias which protected their city-state. Hoplites were not given their equipment by the state since professional armies did not exist yet. Militias were organized by the citizens of a polis. Hoplites had to supply their own armor and weapons, which were not cheap commodities that anyone during this period could get their hands on. The theory of a hoplite revolution assumes that hoplites decided that unless the elite shared political power with them, they would refuse to fight and thus weaken the national defense of the polis. This is a perfectly fine explanation for how hoplites gained their political voice, but it still fails to answer the question of how even the poorest of the poor gained theirs. Perhaps the hoplites demanded in their revolution that everyone be granted political rights, but this is just an assumption. We can never know for sure. Regardless of how the divvying out of political rights happened, what matters is that it did, and no alternative to a hoplite revolution has ever been proposed by scholars to explain it. With that said, placing too much emphasis on the development of hoplite armor and tactics during this age seriously misrepresents the nature of warfare in this early period of Greek history. As I stated earlier, full sets of metal armor were not cheap. They were not things that the average person at the end of the Dark Age going into the Archaic Age could afford. Most fighting forces at this time were made up of lightly armored men, most of whom were poor, and this extended well into the Archaic Age. Hoplite warfare took some time to evolve before it became the norm. Another boost in political rights for the poor came from tyrants who were trying to gain enough popular support to usurp power in some city-states. The elite during this time were also less cohesive as a political group due to constantly trying to one-up each other in terms of who was the most powerful or wealthy, so when the poor demanded more rights from them, they couldn't come together as a unified body just to tell them no. Above all, the political changes at the outset of the Archaic Age were inspired by the values of justice and equality expressed in the poetry of Hesiod. It was no longer acceptable for one small group at the top to tell the majority what to do. They all contributed to their community in some way, so it was only fair for decisions to be made communally. While the poorest of freemen were relishing their newfound political rights in the polis, freedom remained only a dream for the many slaves at the bottom rung of Greek society. Slaves were not granted citizenship and had no rights whatsoever. They were considered living property, not people, and were fully controlled by their masters. For the Greeks, slavery was simply part of the natural order. Aristotle wrote, "An article of property is a tool for the purpose of life, and property generally is a collection of tools, and a slave is a live article of property." In Aristotle's view, slavery was natural because some people lacked the rational capacity to govern themselves, but his view was challenged by the fact that prisoners of war who became slaves had once been free. Regardless of what Aristotle thought about depriving people of their freedom, chattel slavery was accepted in all Greek city-states, and most slaves were captives brought from the north and the east to be sold on an international slave market. By 600 BC, the market was so large that even families we would consider middle class by today's standards could afford to own one or two slaves. By the 5th century BC, the slave population in Greece had grown so large that in some city-states they made up 1/3 of the total population. Like free workers, slaves performed all different kinds of labor. Some were household slaves who performed basic chores for their masters. Others worked in manufacturing items such as pottery. Some worked as farmhands, and the unluckiest of them all worked the mines. There were even some communal slaves who were owned by the city-state, lived on their own, and performed their own specialized public services like certifying coinage, assisting magistrates, or even executing criminals. A slave's quality of life varied greatly in ancient Greece. Some slaves had relatively easy lives and were almost treated like a part of the family they served. Others had to endure a living hell filled with sadistic abuse and violent punishments. The adoption of slavery on such a large scale in ancient Greece had a huge impact on women, especially wealthy women, who were charged first and foremost with managing their households. While their husbands spent time outside the home working, women raised children, prepared food, directed slaves, weaved clothing, and oversaw the family finances. In addition to managing their households, poor women also worked outside their homes as merchants in the agora, the public marketplace that was a feature of every Greek settlement. Just as a woman's father was her guardian before she was married, her husband became her legal guardian after she was married. Marriage for the ancient Greeks was not a romanticized relationship like we have today. A husband and a wife did not get married because of their undying love for each other. Marriages were arranged by men first and foremost for the procreation of legitimate children, and then for the preservation of family property. Monogamy was the norm in ancient Greece, and households operated under a nuclear family structure. With that said, there was a double standard for men and women in terms of sexual morality. Greek men could have sexual relations without penalty with their slaves, foreign concubines, prostitutes, and other willing male citizens. Greek women were kept on a tight leash, and the punishments for women caught in adultery were harsh, ranging from divorce to death. The great concern for the two ends of marriage is what led to placing women under the control of men. To put it bluntly, men wanted to be certain that their property would be passed on to their children and not the affair child of another man. While the relationship between men and women in ancient Greece may seem oppressive in the minds of modern people, we must remember that in the Greek mind, the roles given to women were of enormous importance in the life of the polis. The fate of the polis was directly tied to its next generation, and because it was the responsibility of women to rear up its inheritors, their society could not survive without them.